Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Tech Will Save Us, in which we try to understand the social impact of software and how open source and open standards can make it more positive. I can see myself in the room. Tech Will Save Us on Matrix. Please shout if I'm muted or shout if I'm not muted. I'm going to do a silly dance like every episode so you can have time to compensate for the delay. I can see Jonas sees me. I'm probably going to get some reactions that you can hear me or not very soon. I'm not muted. Excellent. So our focus today is on digital identity. Identity has many definitions and touches to an absurd amount of different fields. Personally, I find it fascinating to explore beyond technology, but unfortunately, we won't have enough time to wander in those areas tonight. We will focus primarily on how computers and the services they provide can be made aware of who is trying to do something and whether they should be allowed to do it or not. This might sound trivial and boring, but it's very much not. And let me remind you, we still have not figured out painless printing and scanning after all those years. My two guests tonight are Jens, who is the primary maintainer of Authentik, a supercharged identity provider, and Quentin, who is on the other side of identity since he works on making a service, Matrix, better integrated with identity providers. So, Jens, let's start with you and tell me, who are you and can we see that Authentik project I keep talking about?
Yeah, hi, good evening. I'm Jens. I'm working on Authentik, been for quite some time now. Started out as just me wanting to, well, it started from a different project originally, but then in the end I noticed I was spending most of my time working on the SSO part, and that was really what was interesting to me. And at that I kind of migrated and was like, yeah, I'm just going to turn this into an OpenID or SSO project in general. And that was just the most interesting part to me. And that's where Authentik started. Originally, a while or years ago, it used to be called Passbook before a friend of mine came up with a new name. And yeah, let me quickly show you a quick demonstration of what it can do. I should be seeing my browser window now.
Yes.
So this is my instance for this case. I don't personally use all features that I've implemented, funnily enough. I'd like to keep it pretty simple for myself. But for login, so it's pretty standard, username and password for this case. And in this case, I will go with Duo for push notifications. So I'm getting a notification on my watch or on my phone to approve the login. And then you get this interface here, which is basically just an overview of all the applications that the current user has access to. And we can try out a couple of ones, for example. So I can access AWS, my AWS account, where I run a couple of things. And as you can see up here, I'm logged in with my account. Try to show off some other things as well. For example, a GitLab instance is also one of the very common integrations. So I'm directly logged me into my GitLab instance here. And yeah, there's quite a wide selection of things I have here, and even a bigger selection of things that people in the community have got running and have figured out and documented how to use. And yeah, there's feel free to stop me at any point if I'm talking too much for this demo. So that the other side was mainly from like the end user kind of point of view. This is more the side that you would see from an admin point of view, where you would actually like configure things and customize how things work. So one of the main components here is the applications, which is everything you saw on that overview page, including configuring the icons and what they're called, providers which configure the actual like protocol and technical details behind it, and how the actual like the nitty gritty works behind the scene. A big part of Authentik is flows, which allow you to very much customize what kind of actions happen when logging in and when accessing applications, and allow you to do all kinds of custom logic. So quick overview here, you can see we just recently in a new version updated how these graphs look, and I'm quite happy with them. But here you can see kind of the logic that happens when logging in, So it does like all kinds of checks for reputation, and if like there's been failed login attempts, it will require a captcha, and depending which network I'm in, it's going to do 2FA or not, and all these things are very customizable, which is a very big focus. And yeah, that's kind of the main goal. The main goal from Authentik is kind of to make authentication and single sign-on easier than it's tended to be.
Single sign-on, you say. That's a word I know, but not necessarily everybody knows. From what you showed, Authentik looks like a super hub that is connecting, that is having all the users in a single place and connecting them to many applications. Can you expand a little on what SSO is and why almost all large companies want to use it?
Yeah, so there's a couple kind of concepts coupled behind SSO, I would say. Mostly, the main ones being directory, as in your kind of structure and list of users. And you ideally don't want to have that in multiple places. You would have to have a single place where you have like, okay, this is user A. In the companies, it would be like they're in department A, have this person as a manager, and repeat it for all people. And the other kind of part that you would usually have in a traditional environment, or most businesses nowadays also, that is Active Directory, you would have a set of credentials alongside that that the user can then use to log into various systems. And then the layer on top of that, or the next layer rather, is kind of the more seamless side of it. So with more traditional SSO, or more traditional directory style login, I should say, you have one set of credentials that you can just kind of use everywhere, versus SSO being more like, okay, I'm logged into this one main thing, and then I just click on an application and I'm logged in without having to enter any credentials. So yeah, the main kind of benefit is having only one directory of users and having that all kind of centrally managed, and not needing a lot of credentials, not needing multiple passwords.
So you talk about multiple passwords. This sounds a lot like password managers. Is it solving a different problem? What's the difference between what Authentik does and what Bitwarden, Fastlane, and the likes do?
Yeah, so the kind of main difference is not all applications support SSO for one. A lot of applications require kind of a business tier or kind of an enterprise like contract to have that. And password managers are more for like an individual person to store their credentials for multiple services. And over those services, they might not have as much control as they do in this case. So in Authentik, you would have control over the services, or they would give you an option to use your own identity provider. And then you don't really need passwords for that anymore. You have either your one set of credentials, or you go the route of being like, okay, I want to log in through Google through everything, or Discord, or GitHub, or whatever. So it's very kind of overlapping, I would say. There's certainly, you could use a lot of, or either one for a lot of things to get to the same solution. Yeah.
Right. So I can really see the value of it, having all the users in a central place that will get the same account to connect to all services. It's very useful not only for connection, but also as an administrator and as a CISO, maybe a security officer. I would be very interested in logging users out of all services at once without having to crawl all the services and log them out and prevent access. So that brings a lot of additional value. So a single place where all the accounts live, we could call that a directory, which sounds like Active Directory, or more generally LDAP. Those are technologies that emerged in the mid-90s, so 20 to 30 years ago. Can you remind us briefly what a LDAP is and what was not enough with LDAP, so we needed to come up with new standards and identity providers?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's they're very old kind of technologies, which inherently isn't a bad thing. I mean, stuff like DNS and NTP is very old and is still very good nowadays. But the new kinds of standards for SSO just have a new level of ease of use, I would say. The user doesn't need to, well, for the user, there's mainly like a lot of less worry to, oh, I'm annoyed because I need to type in my password every 3 minutes. But there's also like less worry that they might type it into a phishing site because there's just less times they have to enter it. And these protocols still have a use nowadays. I mean, Authentik can talk and receive LDAP to both get and send its users because it's still a very valid use case. But there's also protocols nowadays like SCIM that kind of try to aim to replace LDAP to a degree with a more modern HTTP-based API. That has its own entire set of difficulties and especially difficulties to implement. But LDAP is still very much, it solves a different problem. I personally don't like to call LDAP login SSO because it isn't really, like, you're using the same set of credentials, which is better. But you still need to log in again. It's not a seamless process as if you just click on a button, are redirected, and then you're logged in instantly.
All right, I can see some limitations to LDAP too. We'll see if you see the same. So there was a general trend of relying more and more on SaaS, and with less jargon. SaaS mostly means relying on services provided by a company that runs software on their own computers, not inside your IT department. So was that one of the limits of LDAP?
It certainly is. LDAP is one of those protocols that you in most cases don't want to open to the internet. And so you would, if you were to use a SaaS LDAP kind of setup, you would have to have a VPN connection or some other kind of network setup that will allow you to not really have that public facing. And with Authentik, it's a lot more, I mean, from the ground up, it's kind of more intended to be public facing. And also the LDAP that Authentik speaks and using the Outpost is not, I mean, I still wouldn't recommend you to put it on the internet, but it's a lot more resistant to things, and it's a lot more kind of built from the base idea is already kind of like, okay, we don't want to like give the user implicit trust because yeah, and things like Active Directory especially, any user can just do a bind against the Active Directory, which in non-AD turns is just a connection, and they can list all users. So you don't really want to expose that to the internet. While in Authentik, you kind of need to go in and be a lot more explicit about which users are allowed to connect to just have a connection, and which users can connect, and then also get a full list of all users in our groups. And by default, you need to be authenticated with actual credentials before you can get the users. So you know, it's a lot more doable, but I still wouldn't recommend it.
All right, so LDAP would be a little bit too talkative for you in general to be comfortable to opening up entirely either on the internet or even to partners, because the security models have shifted from the castle vision where everything you had inside your IT was considered to be secure and basically not under threat, towards more what we call zero trust, where you don't trust anybody, including your partners, so you really want to limit who has access to what. So LDAP would be a little bit too talkative. With the SaaS trend still being strong and going on, because people don't really want to manage their own infrastructure most of the time, IT is support services. You care about the service and not about running your own server. So with SaaS still going strong, does it mean LDAP or the Active Directory are dead?
I mean, I don't think so. Even though it would be very nice, LDAP still, I think, has its use case for a lot of things. And I mean, even Microsoft is trying to force people to go to, you know, not use Active Directory and rather use their cloud service instead. So there's certainly a lot of push kind of against it. But from what I've seen and from the people that I've talked to, in most businesses, you'll still find either LDAP or an Active Directory server somewhere. There's still the push away from it. And kind of the advantage as well of a lot of these SSO protocols is that they don't really need to have LDAP. Because the main kind of, well, LDAP provides the directory and the kind of database for all users. A lot of the SSO protocols on the other side are just like, yep, this is that user. They're a lot more kind of simplified on that certain user and that certain transaction of them logging in. So a lot of them is like, they're still very far apart, but a lot of services nowadays, at least, are moving towards just supporting SSO and just kind of in time creating the user and not needing LDAP, which makes things easier. But I think we're still a couple years at least away from kind of it stopping the standard, being the standard of most businesses.
Yes, most businesses used to have a LDAP, and it's very, very difficult to get rid of your user base or to migrate it to an identity provider. So most identity providers, including Authentik, can use a LDAP as a source. So a user can be prompted for a username and password using Authentik's user interface, and we'll check those credentials against the directory, the LDAP, to check that the user is who they pretend they are. But it's very difficult to migrate away from that. It's good to have a compatibility layer provided by the identity providers. So to go past the LDAP, there were new standards. There is SAML, there is OpenID Connect. What would you say is the major selling point of SAML or OpenID Connect as opposed to the LDAP?
Mainly for the point of the user is just the ease. They just click on a link and they're logged into the application. They don't need to worry about, do I need to input my username or my email address or my other formatted thing or whatever. They click on a button and they're logged in. From the side of an admin, it usually it tends to be a little bit more effort to set up than classic LDAP. Especially since LDAP is so common. There's a lot of people that are very used to how they need to set it up and what they need to enter. And personally, I think at least that OpenID makes it a bit easier than SAML. But there's still quite a few things that can be done wrong, and that the software, at least, I try with Authentik to make it as easy as possible, but there's still a lot of things that can just go wrong. And I don't want to blame anyone for doing anything wrong, but sometimes something is missed in documentation, sometimes updates change things, sometimes a standard is just broken or a third-party thing just interferes. So the setup can be a bit more tedious. But the main benefit at the end of the day is that it's just easier for actually using, and for the day-to-day usage, it just gets out the way. And you don't really even need to think about I need to add this to my password manager and have all my credentials be the same and then have it put in, and worry about phishing sites that might try to steal your credentials, because you can tell that they don't automatically log in, so it's not the real site. So I feel like that's the main kind of benefit.
Very good. We have two interesting questions from the community. We have one. So KGNet88 is telling us LDAP is also used to save company-specific rules and configurations, so much more than identity. I guess this is more in Active Directory territory than pure LDAP usually. You can find many things in an Active Directory, so that's a very fair point. LDAP is not exclusively about identity. Here we are mostly interested about the identity part of it because this is the theme of the episode, but this is a very fair point. We have a question by Diroots who asks us, why does Authentik list that Keycloak does not support LDAP? I think this has to do with Outposts. Maybe we will talk about that a little later.
So the thing on the website, the graph, is it's certainly missing kind of some tooltips to say what exactly it means when it says it's not supported. In the Keycloak sense, the reason why it says LDAP isn't supported is the scenario where Keycloak would provide LDAP to clients, which is, as far as I know, not supported. Might be wrong on that.
Right, so it does not mean that Keycloak is not able to connect to a LDAP to use a LDAP as a data source, but it means that Keycloak is not able to speak LDAP as a server, as a provider.
Exactly, as far as I understood it, yep.
All right. So that was my next question. Can you tell us a little more about the concept of outposts in Authentik? Because in particular, the LDAP outpost is what convinced me to use Authentik for my small scale setup, because I didn't want to deploy a 389DS or a open LDAP. I just wanted to have one identity service. And it turns out that Authentik has a LDAP outpost. So what is it and what is it used for?
Yeah, so Originally, the idea or the reason why Outposts exists is purely a technical one. So Authentik itself is Python. It's a Python Django project that started, as I said, a while ago. But certain things, we all know that Python is not the fastest language around. And certain things are just not that easily or not realistically doable in Python. So the Outpost concept kind of started when we initially added the proxy thing that kind of does similar things to Authelia, as in like forward auth. You'd have like a statement in your Nginx config that sends another request in the background. And because that is very speed sensitive, the requests need to be fast for that. That is written in Go. And there's not really that much easy interoperability between Python and Go. So that's kind of where the kind of concept of an outpost started. I know that the name itself is not it doesn't make the most sense, and the concept itself can be a bit confusing, especially with the embedded outpost. But the kind of the idea that was built on top of that limitation was, okay, you can have outposts, you can deploy them anywhere you want. They just need to have access to the main Authentik server via HTTP, and they can provide stuff like proxying in the beginning, and now also LDAP as a server. They can just provide that wherever you deploy them using that HTTP API in the background, and they would allow you to give you a lot of flexibility for whatever kind of setup you have, wherever you need LDAP or a proxy. And the LDAP outpost is, I think, I don't want to say somewhat. It's also probably been over a year since that was added. But the kind of principle behind it is quite simple. It basically just listens and takes LDAP requests and translates them to the Authentik API, and then kind of translates the result back into LDAP. As with all the other things, there was some issues in the beginning and some concerns concerning to speed, especially since one of the things that I wanted to do was like, okay, we already have this whole customizable flow system to do all this, user customizable all these actions for authentication, and to reuse that for LDAP. So when you use the LDAP outpost and you bind to it, it actually runs a flow in the background, entering the details that you gave it to bind, which allows you to do things like do push notification 2FA using LDAP, which is, I think ADAP supports that as well with some extra tools, but I don't think too many other things support that. But that was also one of the kind of not so fast things. And there's been some improvements in the past couple months to make it faster, with a lot of caching mainly. Yeah, that's kind of the main reason why Outpost exists, and an explanation of what they were intended to be.
That's really neat. For my small-scale deployment, I don't have any issues about speed and performance, but yes, it's really good to know that you are aware of that and trying to fix the things. We have an interesting question from Nick, who tells us, I often hear that SAML is better than OIDC. Personally, I hear the opposite, but but in my experience, is it just more complicated? It is just more complicated and heavyweight. Can you, as an expert, tell me something about it? What do I miss out on when using OIDC rather than SAML?
My answer is yes, both. Yes, and it's better in both. Yes, it's worse. SAML is the older protocol that has been kind of around before OIDC. It's XML based, which again comes down to your taste, whatever you find easier. SAML has with some things you can kind of just tell that they come from a more enterprisey background, from the way that they're made, and SAML is definitely one of those things. Especially once you get into like signing and encryption. But feature-wise, OIDC has quite a lot more features. For example, you can have a setup like that apps like, for example, Plex use, where you have a code that's shown and then you enter it in a website and then it authenticates through that. That's also part of the OIDC spec. You can have great things that basically use one OIDC token to log in on behalf of another user and kind of use that as authentication. So there's a lot more things you can do with it. SAML is, easier to debug, I would say, because with OIDC, you have a lot of stuff kind of happening in the background. You have the initial kind of request that you have in the browser, but there's also stuff happening behind the scenes that you can't really easily look at. While with SAML, you can kind of just open your browser tools and have a look at everything that's happening. So they both have their upsides and downsides. I tend to mostly go with OIDC nowadays, though, just because it has more features and doesn't have XML.
I'm not super fan of XML either. Personally, what I like in SAML is the fact that, as you said, you can just open the browser tools and see what's happening actually, because everything is going through your browser. It's your browser which is doing all the communication through HTTP redirections between the SAML, so the identity provider IDP, and the service provider. So this is the real added value of SAML for me. But for everything else, I really, really like OpenID Connect, especially when it comes to renewing certificates, because everything is just magic with OpenID Connect, when in SAML it's updating the certificates, the metadata, etc. It's lots of work. So I had an additional question, which is quite related. If I'm on a small scale deployment, a self-hoster with just a few services, would LDAP be enough, or can OpenID Connect still bring additional value? What I have in mind is, for example, step-up authentication. Can you tell us a little more about that?
I mean, I would say it very much depends on what you want as a user, or in the case of a self-hosted setup, in the case of an admin. For a lot of people, they don't really have an issue with entering credentials on a bunch of sites and just are fine with having one set of credentials for everything. There certainly is an additional kind of step of needing to actually set all that SSO stuff up. So, if you are interested in that, I would encourage you to give it a try. But if you don't have an issue with entering credentials on multiple different pages, then as long as it doesn't interest you, or you don't, you're fine with that, then yeah, rock on.
All right. So we've been talking about LDAP, SAML, OpenID Connect. That's already a lot of technologies, especially because they are not necessarily super trivial to implement, and they are super sensitive because they touch not only to identity, but also to authorization. So you need to not mess up. So you wrote Authentik, an identity provider that supports all of them. Why creating Authentik? Did you not like all the many providers that are already on the market?
I mean, the background kind of goes back to before I started the project. The thing I was working on before Authentik was intended to be kind of a single pane of glass for everything. Everything being like DNS and domains and emails and web hosting and all these kinds of things. And at some point I realized, 16-year-old me realized that maybe wasn't so doable for a single person. And I noticed I was spending most of my time kind of implementing SSO stuff with that, because even then that project had SAML, had OpenID. And I realized I spent most of my time doing that, and that's what I found interesting the most. So that's kind of where I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna, that seems more doable. That's what I'm doing. Yeah.
All right, so basically you did it because you could, and because it made your life easier to have everything in a single place. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I mean, it certainly also contributed that back then when I was looking at things, the main alternatives were ADFS for Microsoft, and even then I already wasn't the biggest fan of running Windows servers for things that don't require it, and Keycloak, which as good as it is technically, it's not very easy to get started with. They've also made quite a few improvements from last time I looked at it, and made things a lot easier to set up. But back when I at least looked at it in the beginning, there was just long forms with a bajillion options, which were very overwhelming for me. And again, that's just a very personal thing. I'm not trying to diss any project here.
Yeah, I definitely can understand the feeling. The first time I looked at Keycloak was a long time ago, and it felt very Java.
Also that, yeah, it's also the fact that it's Java. I mean, Java is kind of known as a memory hog. And I mean, Python is not really considered as that, even though Authentik also uses quite a bit of memory, more than I would want it to. So it's actually not like much smaller, but I feel like it's still quite a bit easier to at least get started with and use.
All right. So Authentik is open source. Are you the only maintainer? Because that's a lot to maintain.
Currently, I'm the primary maintainer. Yeah, there's been an increasing amount of people contributing, which has been very nice. Mainly in the part of documentation, which is one of the parts that I, as a backend developer, kind of um, from work, struggle with more. Because I'm also writing the code, so I'm like I know how the things work, and so having people help with the documentation has been very nice. And also the growing community on Discord. That has been very supportive of everything. But yeah, mainly main code is from me.
All right. Another question before we take a community question. So open source is sometimes described as being delivered pizza you did not order. Do you accept every contribution by the community, or do you try to steer Authentik in a certain direction?
I try to. I don't. I am very kind of aware of like feature creep and all these things. I don't want completely unrelated things, while at the same time also trying to figure out new things and things that might make sense. Um, so I'm definitely open to most contributions, and we'll try to kind of help people to get to know the code base and get around things and how things are done in the project. But there's also certainly some things where I have to tell people that it doesn't really fit the project or is a very small kind of feature for a very niche amount of people that might not make sense, at least in a long-term sense of keeping it maintained. Yeah, there's no like one sense of or like no one direction that I'm taking it, but trying to kind of stay in the lane of being an identity provider and not kind of going everywhere.
All right, makes sense. We have an interesting question from the community, which is it clusterable and ready for high availability?
Yeah, so that's also one of the things that I very much did from the beginning. While I have back like kind of history and started working as a backend developer, I've also been running a home lab for quite a long time. So Authentik itself is completely stateless. It only needs the Postgres database and a Redis cache, which those can be clustered or not depending on how you want to set up things. But Authentik itself, you can have as many server instances and or worker instances as you see fit. So there's no limits there.
Okay, very cool. And we have another question, which is, so what would you say, why I should use Authentik as my IDP instead of Google? What is your biggest selling point?
I would still say the biggest selling point is both the simplicity and the amount of customizability. Um, there's a lot of use cases that I've seen people do that I didn't even think about, in regards to having special prompts or login flows or needing to authenticate by other means when they come from a certain network or come from a certain kind of region or certain kind of links or whatever. So there's a lot of customizability you can do, and after that the now increasingly large amount of applications that are documented on how to integrate them, which I feel is still one of the or an increasingly big plus point, and kind of the general ease of use I would still say is the main point.
Which is a huge selling point for me, especially as a self-hoster. I want to have a simple setup, and I want things which just work. I don't want to spend time debugging or knowing what's happening behind the scenes. We have another question. I'm not sure I can make sense of it. It's, can Authentik backend logic be integrated into another Django project, one which is now using Django Auth Toolkit? This might be a bit too Pythonic for me. Maybe it makes sense for you.
I mean, the question makes sense, but the answer is no. So because Authentik doesn't really work that way, you can actually use Django all auth. I think that's what, or you can use various Django libraries to authenticate against Authentik. Um, yeah.
All right. Getting back a little to the question about accepting all the PRs, etc. Do you have paid support, or is it possible to pay you to get faster integration of PRs in Authentik if I really, really care about a feature, or should I be maintaining my downstream branch?
I mean, there's currently, so I do kind of GitHub sponsors as a way for people to mainly say thank you and kind of finance some of the resources that Authentik uses, as in from like the hosting side. There is, it says on the sponsor page that there's somewhat of a priority support for sponsors, which I try to do. But the other thing is like this, I just do this in my spare time. So there's no like I have a day job that I work. And I also have my own spare time that I like to spend on other things sometimes. And yeah, I try to, especially for people when they have like a really when it's kind of like borderline of a feature that they would like to see. I'll oftentimes make exceptions to add those things, especially when they're kind of like on the fence, and especially on me deciding on the fence, like maybe we'll add this, maybe we won't. If they have a really convincing argument, or you know um but also it hasn't happened too many times, so I don't have too many like historical things to draw from.
Right. You mentioned doing the support in your free time, and I must acknowledge publicly that I've been one of the people prodding you with a stick sometimes in the evening, asking you silly questions about deployment. And I've been really, really pleasantly surprised by how reactive you were for someone who is doing that in his free time after his job. So thank you very much first for developing Authentik, which is a really, really neat piece of software, and for the great support you are providing, and for the actually excellent documentation that you have created using Docusaurus. I believe it's really neat. You don't have many questions, so simple to use, to deploy, well documented, and with a very nice person doing the support behind the scenes. It's very, very great. Very grateful for Authentik.
Much appreciated.
Little birds told me the future looked even brighter for Authentik, but it's too early to reveal the master plan. What can you publicly say about the future of Authentik?
Stay tuned. A lot of people have been asking for things, and yeah, stay tuned.
All right. My final question. So, in the community, if you have other questions, it's now the time to ask them because I only have one question left. Is there anything you'd like to mention that we did not talk about?
Not really, no. I mean, I'm very happy with the increasing amount of other open source projects that implement SSO, and also the increasing amount of just services that have it without requiring an enterprise tier. And also just a shout out to the entire Discord community and everyone that's contributed, because they're all very nice and very lovely people. And yeah, thanks for everything.
All right. So to wrap up with Authentik, my personal take is that it's a beautiful piece of software. It's really handy even for small-scale deployments, and I like it so much I decided to make a simple playbook to deploy a playground environment for Matrix and Authentik, with pre-populated users in each in case people want to play around with both. I leave a link in the Matrix room while Quentin introduces us to his work. Thank you very much, Jens. And Quentin, it's now time for you to have the floor. Can you introduce yourself and tell us what you're working on?
So yeah, hey everyone. I'm Quentin. I'm an engineer working on Elements, and I think I'll just share my screens because I actually prepared some slides. Yeah, so I'll be talking about a bit about what I'm working currently at Elements, and basically the story started more than 2 years ago now, when I actually as an external contributor, I contributed the login via OpenID Connect in Synapse, which is the main Matrix server that most people are running. And while working on that, I found out how Matrix actually authenticates its users, and found a few issues with it. And a few months later, basically, Element got me hired to actually work on this. So my role at Element is actually working on everything that touches identity and authentication in Matrix. So yeah. So I did prepare some slides. Like, feel free to, hopefully it won't be that long. Feel free to like stop me, ask questions down the line. I think maybe not everyone is familiar with what Matrix is. So to put that quickly, Matrix is a protocol that lets you exchange messages, exchange events. It's basically the equivalent of other protocols like SMTP and IMAP for emails, but for chat rooms. And how it works is that you could have your account on some server that we'll call the home server, and you connect to that home server with a Matrix client, and that lets you communicate with other people on that have accounts either on your server on other servers. So that's what basically we see here in that diagram here. And just for a bit of like terminology here, so you as the user, you use your Matrix client on your mobile phone, your desktop. It can be, you have many open source Matrix client available to you. And that communicates to your home server via an API, which is spec'd in the Matrix project as the client server API. And your home server then can talk to other home servers via the server to server API. Here, right, I'll mainly focus on the client to server API, because at some point the Matrix client has to know how to log in your account. How do you enter your credentials, identify yourself, and authenticate? And that's defined in the client server API of Matrix. And right now, how it works, I'm really oversimplifying here, but right now how it works is that your client, within the native UI of your client, once you chose your which server to talk to, it will show you a prompt of that lets you enter your credentials. So you enter your username and password directly in your client. Your client then sends that back to your home server, and from there you get back an access token that is then used to authorize subsequent API calls. And all of this is very custom to Matrix. A lot of the client to server API of Matrix is not dedicated, but is about like authenticating and managing your own account. So you will like the client will create your account via the Matrix API, or we will reset your password, or delete your account, and stuff like that. All of that happens and is defined in the client to server API. And this has some benefits. For example, it means like you always stay in your client. You have a lot of things that are inside your Matrix client, your Matrix app, and it feels native. Like the username and password are native fields in your app, or the delete your account button is right here within your client. Some downside of it is that that means that every single client, if they want to be fully featured, they have to implement all of that, all the account management features, and that can be tricky. Also, that's also what I found out when implementing login via OpenID Connect in Synapse, is that some of those endpoints, some of those APIs don't really implement like the current best security practices, especially when you're logging in via some SSO provider, so logging via Google, Twitter, or something like that.
Are you saying Matrix is insecure?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there are better industry standards that do that better than us. And also, like, because Matrix is primarily a specification of those APIs, any changes to those to implement new features like two-factor authentication or WebAuthn based credentials, all of those, you will need a change in the spec, and also like change in the servers and change in the clients. And another really important point that we already touched a bit in while talking about Authentik is that right now we are training our users to enter their full Matrix credentials on different web pages and native apps that claim to be Matrix clients, and this makes it this makes it harder for users to protect themselves against phishing and other stuff like that, and you have to put a lot of trust in your Matrix clients. I have a kind of a hot take, maybe a bit controversial for some people in the Matrix ecosystem, but Matrix itself is not an authentication and account management API. It's not the core of the protocol is about exchanging messages. It's not about how do you register a user, or how do you change your password, or how do you link an email address to your account. So let's what I started doing is like taking a step back and saying, hey, maybe it's not the job of Matrix of doing the whole authentication and account management part. So let's pick up some industry standard to actually like do the authentication dance, and let's introduce another component in our architecture of a standalone authorization server that where your Matrix home server will delegate authentication to. How it looks like is that when your user wants to log in on your Matrix client, so after choosing which server it wants to authenticate against, it will get redirected. Redirected to a web page controlled by your authorization server, and that's just a web page where at that point, basically the authorization server can do anything to authenticate the user. Jens showed in Authentik that you can do a lot of stuff with this kind of SSO, like having 2FA via push notification or some other passwordless login method. It doesn't really matter. Once the authentication is complete, you get back to your client with an access token, and then this access token is being used to authenticate, to authorize requests to the client to server API. And then, like for the home server, your Matrix server, its job is now only to verify those tokens. It's just to ask the authorization server if that token is valid or not. So this might be a bit biased, but we see a lot of good implication of this. For example, it's a lot of simpler for home servers and clients to implement, because clients don't have, for example, to implement all the password recovery methods or the whole registration dance of like displaying a captcha to the user and stuff like that. And same for the home server. If they can delegate that to another piece of software, they don't have to support all of those API endpoints to manage the user account. And we also benefit a lot of like the wider community around that standard. Supposedly, if that standard is really used anywhere, you have a lot of existing SDKs and a lot of more battle-tested implementations. And it also means for us that we're moving a lot of authentication related stuff outside of the matrix spec. So that lets us focus a lot more on stuff that we're good at, exchanging messages, and lets other people that are more focused on authentication and authorization, do their job on this other spec. So basically, that's what I've been working on, is moving the whole matrix protocol to use natively OpenID Connect as the authorization layer, the authentication and authorization layer in Matrix. Just like a quick terminology stop. I'll sometimes use like those two terms interchangeably. Like, you often sometimes you talk about OpenID Connect, sometimes you talk about OAuth. So basically, to get this quickly, OAuth is an authorization framework it's a bunch of RFC from issued by the IATF. And on top of that, you have OpenID Connect, which is some kind of standard built on top of OAuth. And what I'm trying to say here also is that those two standards are really widely used, and they cover a lot of use cases. And for an end user perspective, like at a high level, I already touched a bit on that. Like for the user, what it means is OpenID Connect basically works usually by completing the authorization in a web page controlled by your OpenID Connect provider. So that's a huge shift. That's the biggest shift on the user perspective, is that instead of entering your credentials within your Matrix client UI, you enter that on a web page that is controlled by your home server. So that, yes, I made those slides this afternoon, so I don't exactly remember what I put in there. But yeah, from the user's perspective, you're logging from a web page, and this also means that this web page is always the same regardless of the client, which has really great implications in terms of for example, for password managers. Password managers usually save your password bound to a specific domain, and if you're logging into multiple clients that are on different domains, you will get your password manager confused. Whereas if you're always logging in the same on the same origin, on the same domain, your password will be correctly bound. And it's the same for WebAuthn credentials. So everything like logging in via your fingerprint or your face or stuff like that, that's also bound to the origin. The other user-facing change that we expect is that instead of having accounts-related stuff within your Matrix client, you'll get that in some dedicated page that is controlled by your home server. So that lets your home servers display a lot more stuff, and a lot more specific stuff. Like we can imagine having a view of like an audit log of everything happening security-wise and login-wise on your account, or have a better view of like your current active sessions with like which clients you're currently connected on which device on which location, which we could have kind of implemented in the Matrix API and display that on client, but it would have been more. It's really more work of like, sometimes you have like a lot specific use cases that you want in one specific deployment. And right now, if you want to do that, you would have to define the API, support that on the server, and support that on the client side. I have a few demos to show you how it looks. Maybe it will make more sense. So right now, this is all work that is currently not merged in most clients and server. It's just a branch that we have apart, so you can't try that on your own home server right now. But we have a public playground where you can try that out with some modified clients. So for example, hopefully, is that big enough? Maybe I'll zoom a bit. So this is Hydrogen, which is a lightweight matrix client on the web. And once I chose my home server here, if I click continue here, instead of having my username and password displayed here, what I'll get is redirected somewhere else. So you notice here I'm not on off-oidc.lab.element.dev, which is my OpenID Connect server. And here I can log in. It will show me what I'm currently doing. It says, hey, you're about to let Hydrogen Web access to this part of your matrix accounts. And I can allow that. And once I consented to that, I'm logged in, and this is my usual matrix client. So that was the first demo. And one important thing I think is that maybe you saw is that when I started logging in, you noticed, for example, that my password manager popped up, and that's because my credentials on here are really bound to this particular website. So if I try that with another client that I'll show later, it will also work as is. It also means that I can do here, I'm just doing anything I want in a web page. This server in particular just implements simple login via a username and password, but I could have something that logs in via my Google account, or by sending me a link to my email address, or anything basically you could imagine. I also could show you how I would create an account. Is that on this server? Is that for example, how it looks like is, yeah, I'll save that. If I create an account, it will ask me to check my emails. I'll get an email from the authentication server saying, hey, this is your code to verify that email. I'll submit. I'll re-enter my passwords, and I'm now logged in. This is something in Matrix that, I just showed you, registering your account. This is something in Matrix that we historically struggled a lot about, in my opinion, because if you try to create your account on Elements, the flow to register is a lot more complicated than that, and we had a hard time actually changing that, because changing the registration process means changing the spec, means implementing that in the server, implementing that in the client. Whereas here, if I want to change anything in my login flow, I don't have to change anything to the spec. My server could implement any kind of flow and make it as easy or as hard as they want, and it would be a lot quicker to implement. I do have a lot other demos to show, but maybe I've talked alone for quite some times now, Tib. So
Actually, I think you had another interesting demo. So if it's ready, you can show it, because I believe it was about a mobile client. Is the demo ready? Can we show it?
Yeah, it is. So the other demo tip is talking about is you may have heard of one other client that Element is currently working on, which is an iOS client, which is called Element X, which is a completely rewrite from the ground up of a Matrix client. And one interesting thing with Element X is that we implemented login via OpenID Connect natively right from the beginning. So here I'm on a private beta, I guess, of a private build of Element X. This is how the login looks like basically. So you see here, if I'm like choosing a standard server, it will prompt me for the username and password within the app. But then if I instead use the same server as before, so that's synapse dash OIDC dash lab dot element dot dev, I think. Yes. Yeah, instead of prompting me the credentials right here, it asks me to continue. If I do that, well, that's one important thing here that you see on iOS. It's that iOS will explicitly tell you what's happening. It will tell you, hey, your current app wants to try to use element.dev to authenticate. So if I do that, here I see, well, the credentials of the account I just created seconds ago, because in the Magic Apple ecosystem, everything is synced in real time with your password manager and stuff. And if I do that, here it will say you, hey, Element X iOS wants to access your Matrix account. Do you want to allow it or not? And if I do allow, it will log me in. That home server is probably a bit bugged. That's why this account is empty. That's why it doesn't show anything. But that's just to show how it works. And if I sign out, let's say if I was already logged in some other application, instead of having to in some other Matrix client on my phone, instead of having to log in, if I try to log in again, synapse element dev. So if I try to log in again, here I'm already logged in. Like I'm already in Safari on my system browser. I'm already logged in. I already have an existing session, so it doesn't prompt me the credentials. So that was one thing that Jens talked about. One big advantage of having a single sign-on server is that you usually on one device have to enter your credentials only once, instead of having to do that for every single app you're logging in. And yeah, that's about it for my demos.
Thank you very much. Demo of Element X, and it's not even Matrix Live. Woohoo! We are lucky. So thanks a lot for the presentation and demystifying everything about OpenID Connect and Element. My key takeaway would be, from a user perspective, there is not a lot that would change, because at the end of the day, I would still need to authenticate, click accept, and I'd be logged in Matrix. Especially on mobile, I find it very user-friendly. You are not really redirected to a browser, moved out of the application. It might be what is happening behind the scenes, but from my perspective, I'm just presented with a window that happens to nearly be inside my application, and I can just type in my credentials. So it's very cool. We have a question from the community. Somebody is saying, don't we already all have that right now, all you have talked about? Because I've been logging into my home server using OIDC forever.
Yeah, and so not exactly. So how the current login via OpenID Connect works right now with your Matrix server is that the Matrix API has a special login method, which is called m.login.sso, which is very generic to like log you in with any kind of SSO. And how it works is that basically you get redirected to a web page controlled by your home server. Then your home server does the authentication dance, and you get back to your client and with an access token. It's very similar to OAuth, to OpenID Connect, but this is like defined within the Matrix spec. And what Synapse does is when you get redirected to Synapse, it will itself start an OpenID Connect flow with whatever OpenID Connect provider you're using. So if you're logging via Google, it will start a login flow via Google. And at the end, once you verified that session, once you verified that login, Synapse will issue an access token that is issued by Synapse. The difference here is that instead of having Synapse do the OpenID Connect dance with whatever OpenID Connect provider you're using, it's the client that is directly doing that dance. So your client will log in via your OpenID Connect provider directly, and at the end, your OpenID Connect provider will issue itself an access token that you can then use with the Synapse API. It will basically it's more of a change of like, instead of defining in the Matrix client to server API itself how a client does the login, we just say, hey, the client should use OpenID Connect directly with that endpoint, and the other details are handled by the OpenID Connect spec itself and not by the Matrix spec.
Your explanation makes a lot of sense because the person who asked it said, so Synapse is my OpenID Connect consumer currently, and Element will be the consumer after you change, which I believe is the case.
Yeah, exactly.
So next question is, I can easily imagine why some tinkerers could be worried because a browser is involved. And sometimes when you are hacking on things, you just want to be in a terminal, or just to have a console, or just write a little script that does thing. So if I want to write a bot, for example, instead of implementing login and password-based authentication, I need to play with a browser. I need to do all the dance. Wouldn't that be terrible in terms of hackability of Matrix?
Well, the thing is, first of all, like, OpenID Connect itself is very flexible. It has a lot of different login flows that lets you log in via static credentials, or by logging via another device or stuff like that. But also, you can see this like the same way if you ever interacted with, for example, the GitHub API. On GitHub, with the GitHub API, you can you have like multiple way to authenticate. Either you do a proper OpenID Connect, of clients, and you make your user identify themselves via the browser, because you want to build an app that is directly that is publicly available, and you want to properly integrate with GitHub. Or you also have the option to generate what GitHub calls personal access tokens, and those tokens are usually like long-lived, and from within the GitHub interface, you can just tell it to, hey, generate me an access token, long-lived access token that has access to my repos and has access to my profile, but not this and this, and then it generates for you a long-lived access token. So this is also the kind of things we can imagine with OpenID Connect with your provider. Your provider could have a feature within its web interface to generate an access token that is long-lived, and you just use this access token statically in whatever script you need.
So what you're telling me is actually moving to OpenID Connect could make things even simpler for tinkerers, because you would not even have to do the login dance with the login and password. You would have a simple way to retrieve an access token, which is not necessarily the same as the client you are using today.
Well, yes and no. Yes, because like I assume that your OpenID Connect provider provides this kind of functionality of like just generating a long-lived access token. But at the same time, that's not spec. That's not something we enforce on providers to have this kind of functionality. That depends on the provider. But I think the more important aspect for tinkerers, in my opinion, is that right now, if you log in with, if you put your matrix credentials in some tool, because in some script or whatever, that script has full access to your whole account. That script could make ban other people's in room, or make people make you yourself leave room, or send messages to on your behalf. Here we have a way to give restricted access to this kind of scope. You're to this kind of token. You have like if you're used to this person access token in GitHub, you have this long list of scopes that you can choose to say, hey, I want this specific token to only have access to that, and that's something that wasn't possible before.
Right, so that was going to be my next question. So beyond freeing some mental space for people who write Matrix project, OpenID Connect brings other benefits. So in terms of UX, for example, would you have example? For example, if I want to access critical features in my client, it would be able to prompt me again.
Yeah, so that's the other thing, is that so we expect with this to be able to introduce this notion of scopes in the API, saying, for example, that banning a user from some room requires your access token to have one specific scope. So we could imagine having your clients usually be logged in with just the usual set of scopes that you need to use your client to read messages and send messages and stuff like that. But then if you need to do some unusual action, or action that are a bit more destructive, um, there's a way in OpenID Connect to actually, like, well, re-authenticate and step up your authentication. For example, we could ask temporarily for the scope that allows you to ban people, and that could be implemented in any sort of way any way you want on your OpenID Connect provider. That could, for example, require you to re-enter your password, or complete some challenge. So instead of having your client having all the rights to your whole account at all time, we now have this way to temporarily step up the authorization level of your current connection, and step down later when it's not needed anymore.
So in a way, that would definitely be more secure, because for the basic actions, you could have your trivial regular access token, and for more specific actions, you would be asked to have another factor of authentication. So it would be a good way not to ask for a second factor of authentication for everything and to get in the way all the time, but just to get in the way when it really, really matters. So it's a UX improvement, and it's more secure, so it's a very welcome change. I have a question. OpenID Connect is not everybody is aware of that, but OpenID Connect is what powers the login with Google buttons. Does the move to OpenID Connect mean we will get to login with Matrix button?
Maybe. The thing is, we're only using a lot of already established standards. we do have to add some rules on stuff we need that is not that common in the global web, I guess. There's already like some other initiative to have like a generic login via OpenID Connect. It's already kind of possible with OpenID Connect. The thing is, like, it didn't really reach its critical mass right now to be really like available everywhere. And then there's also like some problems with trust. Like, you have to trust whatever OpenID Connect provider you'll be using. So maybe that matrix moving to OpenID Connect and basically having every single matrix server being an OpenID Connect provider will help having a lot more web apps actually implementing like generic login via OpenID Connect options. Whereas it's branded as login via metrics or login via OpenID Connect, it's just like a branding issue, I guess. But yeah.
Right. You mentioned Synapse. Will it be Synapse itself that will be acting as an OpenID provider?
So that's like one confusion that we often have with this whole OpenID Connect project, is that we're not expecting like your client to do, for example, the OpenID Connect dance directly with Google or with Twitter. What will usually happen is that your client will do the OIDC dance with the OpenID Connect server that is dedicated to your home server, which in turn might log you in via Google or log in via Twitter. But it really means that your home server itself, like as part of your OpenID Connect of your Matrix deployment, you will have an OpenID Connect server dedicated to that deployment. We had basically two options to do that for implementing that. We could have made Synapse itself implement the OpenID Connect APIs. That would have been a possibility, but for well, many reasons, I can maybe elaborate on that later. But we decided basically to write our own OpenID Connect provider aside from Synapse, and so we expect like for people to deploy that server alongside Synapse and make Synapse communicate with that server. But yeah, it's just like, this is just an implementation detail that could, your home server could provide itself the OpenID Connect server capabilities, and we also expect like to ship an embed version of that OpenID Connect server within Synapse for simple deployments where you don't want to care about like running multiple services. But yeah, that's just an implementation detail.
Yeah, you say it's an implementation detail, but as somebody who is hosting his own Synapse, if I didn't have an Authentik server already being an IDP, I would have been a little annoyed to have to deploy another service. So I'm quite happy to learn that you envision to package it together and ship a single container, for example, with Synapse and that new OpenID provider. Which raises the question, because I use Authentik as an OpenID provider, will I still be able to use my own OpenID provider, such as my beloved Authentik instance?
And I think it's interesting because you in the room actually like asked the same kind of question, like, can Authentik be used as an OpenID Connect provider directly? It will depend on what Authentik implements from the OpenID Connect spec. So we've been experimenting with that idea, and for example, we have deployments where instead of using our own OpenID Connect server, we're using Keycloak, an off-the-shelf standard OpenID Connect server. We haven't tried with Authentik yet, But the thing is, we're relying on some part of OpenID Connect that are not widely used. For example, um, widely available. For example, in like standard OpenID Connect deployments that you usually use, you like know with which client will authenticate. You will might authenticate with GitLab or authenticate with use your OpenID Connect provider to authenticate against GitLab or something else, and that's like a static list of OpenID Connect consumer of OpenID Connect clients. In the Matrix ecosystem, we don't know how many clients your user will use. It might use Element Web, or it might use Fractal on desktop, or Neko on desktop, or Element on Android, or something like that. So we're relying on a part of the spec that is called dynamic client registration, where the client itself sends metadata about them and dynamically creates a new client on the OpenID Connect provider. And that's usually a part that are not um, always completely open on providers. So yeah, that depends on the implementation. But yeah, to fully answer to that, you will be able to use Authentik as an upstream IDP, meaning that your Matrix client will do the IDC dance with your dedicated OpenID Connect provider, but that one in turn will authenticate against Authentik instead of relying on its inner login and password credentials.
All right, so worst case, it will be possible to sort of chain the providers to keep using my IDP, to keep using Authentik, and not being forced to move to your own implementation. But there's a saying in our field that says, don't write your own crypto. It sounds like it could be applied to identity as well. And how can you be confident that your OpenID provider will work well?
That's a good question. Um, well, we first I'll say that we did worse in the Matrix project by not only developing our own authentication provider, but doing our own authentication protocol. So at least that's an enhancement from before. So instead of like defining our own protocol, we're just defining our own implementation. Now, one great thing about OpenID Connect is that uh, there's a lot of test suites and conformance suites that you can use to test your implementation, and it's really well documented, like what to look out and what kind of security issues you might have. You have like dedicated RFCs, well, drafts of RFCs um, from the IETF that are just about best security practices for OAuth servers. And well, I'm not claiming that our implementation will be the most secure ever, but I think like we have a lot of resources to ensure that we're implementing that right.
All right. Don't quote me on that. It just occurred. I believe Mastodon, which is another federated project, uses dynamic client registration behind the scenes. So with Oath too. So it's not like you're going for something completely exotic. It's something that's still standard in the OpenID Connect specification.
Yeah, I think I also saw that, and I think that Mastodon is acting as its own, is implementing its own Auth2 server within Mastodon. So we're not the only one to do that, basically.
Yes. Is there anything else people should know about OpenID Connect and Matrix we have not talked about yet?
I do have a lot of things to talk about, but probably we don't have the time. There's a lot of implications about widgets and in widgets, or we also like have this vision of like this whole work will enable in the future uh, like for me, almost a new version of the Matrix ecosystem, where I hope in the future we'll see apps that are built on Matrix, but that are not necessarily chat clients. Because right now, one problem we have with building on top of Matrix is that every single thing that wants to use Matrix currently has to have access to your full account, and you maybe don't want to like give access to your private messages to some app that claims to do, I don't know, collaborating document editing or stuff like that. We have a lot of other applications in Matrix other than chat, but that are, in my opinion, a bit blocked by this fear of like having a lot of piece of softwares that currently have access to your whole account, all your chat messages and such. Yeah, so that was like one of the things I really want people to also really understand about this whole work, is that this will enable this kind of stuff in the future, and that's really exciting.
It is exciting indeed. Personally, I can't wait for this to happen, because there is a lot more than just how to phrase that. It's not a tantrum thrown by geeks who want to do things an academic way. There are real life consequences, especially in terms of user experience and security, which are going in the right direction. So thank you very much, Quentin, for sharing all your work about Matrix and OpenID Connect. My personal conclusion from this episode is that there are many benefits to rely on an identity provider, even for small-scale deployment. It brings consistency to the set of services you provide, enhances user experience, can allow you to step up your security game by adding MFA at low cost. It's really a must-have. It solves different problems than password providers, since password providers are centered around the user, when identity providers are centered around the organization or entity providing a set of services. I would personally love to be able to use login with my own identity provider everywhere, but OpenID Connect and the likes were not designed with that in mind exactly, or maybe diverge a little later. So I can strongly recommend Authentik in any case, which is a beautiful piece of software that does a lot of the things you might need, even on smaller scale deployment like self-hosters. And finally, I'm excited to see what the future holds for Matrix and OpenID Connect. I want modular interfaces with painless integration of widgets. I want security for critical actions on my account. I want to be able to get the top-notch standards in terms of identity without having Element, the Matrix.org Foundation, or any player in the Matrix ecosystem to spend time integrating it. I really hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next month for another episode on open text and open standards. See you around!